I'm ahead of the curve, also known as James Bergman, and in today's discussion I am talking to Rabbi Jonathan Romain. Jonathan is a writer and broadcaster and director of the Maidenhead Synagogue in England. He also has a PhD in the history of British Jewry. Myself and Jonathan go over the fundamentals of Judaism, as well as him explaining why there are Orthodox Jews, why there are conservative Jews, and why, as Jonathan is himself, Reform Jews. Jonathan also explains how Judaism is distinct from Islam and Christianity, and why Judaism also rejects the claim that Jesus Christ was divine. And as well as this, amongst many other things, by the end we also have a conversation about whether we actually need religion in the modern age. For me, this was certainly a unique discussion because Jonathan is the first representative of Judaism that I've actually featured on the channel. And so, as you may tell, I was bursting with many questions in the hour that we had. If you enjoy the video, please consider subscribing for more content on philosophy, theology, literature, psychology. Make sure that you leave a like for the algorithm, as well as also commenting what you think. I would be interested in you as a Christian maybe, or a Muslim, or an atheist, what you think of Judaism in comparison to other worldviews or lack thereof. Remember, if you want to help support the channel, if you want to help me get better equipment for the interviews that I conduct, you can always go to my Patreon or PayPal to do so. I hope you enjoyed this discussion as much as I did, and remember, leave your thoughts of what you think. All right, enjoy. Jonathan Romain, great to have you on. I wanted to get straight into it and ask you, what is it like to be a rabbi?
Well, the short answer, what it's like to be a rabbi, is good fun.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I wouldn't do it. I mean, if for those who are not familiar with what a rabbi is, it's essentially the same as a vicar. In other words, obviously we take services, but actually it's a terribly small part of the week. There's also the cycle of life aspect, the births and the bar mitzvahs and the weddings and the divorces and the deaths. And so we're involved in a lot of weddings and funerals and baby blessings. And then there's a whole tranche of education, whether it's for the children, religion school or adult education, or education to the wider society, going around to local schools and scout groups and WIs or whatever. And one of the great things about being a rabbi, well, there's two things. One is a big job of satisfaction, because hopefully you're making the world a better place and helping other people's lives. I have to say, it's not just pure altruism. There's also a selfish element to it in that, I enjoy it, but hopefully it's something that's useful to others as well. And the other great thing about being a rabbi is that no day is ever the same. And every day is varied. I might start off with, doing a school assembly, then I'm going to do a hospital visit, then I'll maybe do a radio broadcast, then I'll sit down with a wedding couple, and then I'll write a sermon, or then I'll write an article, and every day is a complete mishmash, and there's no repetition, and it's always very exciting and very much on the go.
It does sound. It sounds like one of the, because there are those kind of jobs or sort of careers where that can be said, where it is literally different every single day, and I think it boils down to the fact that it's always encountering other people, and people are always going to be in some sense unpredictable, and there's going to be new problems or even solutions that you might come up with. Could you go into the history of what it means to be a rabbi and where it came from, that idea, that role?
Well, you're certainly right that it's not an ivory tower. In fact, my father was a bit worried that I'd just be, studying away in my office all day. And actually, no, it's very much with the people and all the messy details. I mean, it's a combination of Vicar of Dibley, dealing with dotty parishioners, and Rev, and dealing with all the sort of murky social issues and problems that people encounter. And, whether it's divorce or adultery or murder or a fraud or, all the negatives and lots of positives as well. But, it very much isn't an ivory tower. And, rabbis have been around more or less for about 2,000 years. Whereas the original leadership of the Jewish faith was sort of the prophets, people like Moses, and then it became the priests. But really, more or less since the time of Jesus, who some people will describe as a rabbi, but perhaps was not, as more of a sort of a preacher and teacher. Rabbis have been around for 2,000 years. And as I said, it's a little bit like a vicar. So, you're based with a particular area. I have a congregation, a synagogue. In my case, it's Maidenhead. It's quite a large area. We cover the whole of the sort of Berkshire, Buckinghamshire, Oxfordshire. We've got about 900 households, and so they keep me busy.
Fair enough. Yeah, I mean, 2,000 years is quite a long time for, for I guess tradition to improve upon its routines and things like that. And this kind of leads into the next question. You're well known as in the Jewish community as a representative of Reform Judaism. What is this embodiment of Judaism, and how is it different to the conservative and Orthodox traditions? I'd love to hear your explanation of that.
Yeah, I mean, there are there's lots of little groups, but it's probably easiest to say there are two broad groups. One is the Orthodox, and the other is the Reform, sometimes known as liberal or progressive. And the difference is the C word, change, the ability to change. And the Orthodox are, by and large, a bit of a generalization coming up, but, by and large is rooted in tradition. The Bible is the word of God. You can't really deviate from it. Nothing more important than the word of God. Whereas Reform would say, well, the Bible is inspired by God, but it's written down according to human understanding, limitations of human understanding, and according to their worldview, 2,500, 3,000 years ago, the other side of the world, in a nomadic society. And therefore, it was time bound. And our job, if you like, is to separate that which is eternal, some of the really important values, thou shalt not kill, etc., and things that are more limited, and of course constantly updated so that it's applicable to today and today's values. So Reform, so the change and the ability to change is the key difference. You would see it in practice if you were perhaps not Jewish. If you went to an Orthodox synagogue, it would be entirely in Hebrew, because that's the traditional language. My and other Reform synagogues would be Hebrew and English, a mixture of the two, 50-50 maybe, a mixture of tradition and the fact that English is our mother tongue. If you went to that Orthodox synagogue, you would see men and women separate. The men at the front, women at the back, or men downstairs, women upstairs. Whereas going back to a society and a view where men and women had different roles, whereas in the Reform we regard women as equal. I almost feel silly saying it, but we take it for granted, and therefore men and women sit together, pray together. We have women rabbis, and again, that ability to change and say, well, even if males dominated in the past, it's a different world today, and therefore we're prepared to have women, delighted actually to have women as rabbis and officiants.
Yeah, because what I've read is that the Orthodox kind of tradition isn't so fond of the Reform, traditional interpretation of the text and the understanding of Judaism. Why do you think there is such a? Would you call it an intolerance of the moving times?
Yeah, it's the same difference or antagonism, if you like, between any branch of a faith where they both claim to be the real faith. So just like you've got battles between the Catholics and the Protestants. They don't burn each other at the stake like they used to, but they did for a long time. And now there are still arguments over the validity of each other's traditions. You've got the thing between Sunnis and Shias in Islam, and they both hate the Ahmadiyas. And you've got all sorts of different groups in different faiths. So that's normal, unfortunately, for faith. We are learning to live together. And I have to say, actually, that things have improved quite a bit in the relations between Orthodox and Reform. And whereas perhaps the Orthodox were very, very hostile to Reform, now they don't accept them as right. But we sit down together and talk together and are reasonably amicable and agree to disagree.
Yeah. So could you go a bit deeper into the kind of practical differences between the Reform and the Orthodox tradition, and even the conservative, like how, I don't know, is there an easy way to kind of split them up as like, okay, so there's this particular practice in the Reform, and then there's a particular practice, like what are differences? Because I know that there's there's quite a lot of profound routines and beliefs in the Orthodox position for sure.
You mean the difference between Orthodox and Reform?
So the practical kind of behavior from
well, I mentioned two already. I mentioned two already: Hebrew only in the Orthodox, mixture of Hebrew and English. Women not being regarded as fully participantly, not able to participate fully in the Orthodox. They would say, by the way, that they regard women as equal. It's just that women can't do certain things. So you can put your interpretation on that.
Yeah, a bit dubious, perhaps. Yeah.
So another practical example might be how you observe the Sabbath. I mean, you shall not work on the Sabbath. Well, that seems pretty clear, but actually, no, it's not. I mean, because what's the definition of work? So for the Orthodox, you're not allowed to travel on the Sabbath, because back in the day, traveling on your donkey was dirty, laborious, time-consuming, dangerous, going through forests. Now, of course, getting in the car facilitates things. So the Orthodox still maintain you shall not travel, and therefore you have to walk to synagogue, whereas we have a big car park because people will drive 20, 30 miles, or perhaps, are in wheelchairs or for whatever reasons. So for us, it's not an issue of how you get to synagogue. You can come on a pogo stick all along the M4. It's coming to synagogue is being part of the community. Another difference would be in modern sexuality. Orthodoxy would, by and large, hold to the biblical view of that it's an abomination, which of course some Christian groups do, and therefore would see it as a sin, as wrong. We would say, well, look, gay people, it's not a career choice. They are gay by birth, and therefore you could say God created them gay, and therefore, well, if God created them gay, how can we reject them? And therefore, we would see gay people as fully equal and entitled to everything that heterosexual is, and therefore we would do gay marriages and have no problem with a gay member of the community or even a gay rabbi. And there are gay rabbis or lesbian rabbis.
Well, for sure that isn't taken too well on the Orthodox the viewpoint.
But interestingly enough, of course, you would see these same battles. Christians would recognize the battle over women, the battle over gays, as being played out in exactly the same way in the Christian world. Not accepting female clergy or female bishops, and so the issue is the same between the Orthodoxy and the Reform of virtually every faith. And it was quite interesting. I went to an interfaith conference of Muslims and Christians and Jews, and then we all sort of had lunch together. And I sort of assumed that the Christians would all sit together and the Muslims would all sit together and the Jews would sit together. No, and what happened was the liberal Muslims, Christians and Jews sat together, and the Orthodox Reforms, because they had the same worldview and spoke the same language in many ways.
Right. Yeah. Well, it can definitely come out. Well, I mean, it's making me think actually, because I've been reading a book on the history of Judaism by Martin Goodman. I think that's his name, and he actually cited. I don't know. It was kind of written as a horrendous, but also slightly amusing scenario where they tried to, the different groups try to kind of come together and have this dinner, and actually the catering staff miscatered, and they only thought it was just pork, but actually there were shellfish and other things like that that they found disagreeable, and there was this kind of uproar, and it was Martin Goodman kind of it was funny because it was in one way amusing but also not, because it was an attempt to bring people together, but actually it did the opposite because of the mistake of a catering team. So I wanted to ask you, how do you come to the conclusion that the Torah is to be trusted as the divine scripture from God?
Well, I suppose because it works is the simple answer. I mean, I can't prove, like, no one can really prove any of the sanctity of any text. I mean, it's all been handed down in the dim and distant past. But the question is, does it speak to us today? Does it have something worth paying attention to? Is it a good guide for life? And to which my answer would be yes. I mean, there are many people who would say no and therefore become secular, or who would say no and say the grass is greener on the other side and would then convert to another faith. But for me, and obviously many Jews, the Torah, the Bible, that is, or the first 5 books of the Bible, and subsequent Jewish tradition do make sense. I emphasize subsequent Jewish tradition because actually we're often referred to today as rabbinic Jews rather than biblical Jews. Because if you look at the Bible and look at Judaism today, it is vastly different. A whole one of the complete books of the Bible, a fifth of it, Leviticus, is really all about sacrifices and chopping up little lambs and offering them up at the altar. We haven't done that for 2,000 years. Judaism has changed enormously and evolved Judaism, and it's through the lens of the rabbis. So to give you a good example, so some things that they sort of expanded from the Bible, and some things they limited. So, for instance, they limited the death penalty. It's all over the place in the Bible. Death penalty for this, death penalty for that. But the rabbis decided round about the year naught, at the time of Jesus, to abolish the death penalty, which was quite radical, bearing in mind we didn't do it in Britain until 1966 or 67. Now, they couldn't quite deny what the Bible had said, so they worked around it. So it says, for instance, that if you commit adultery, you're subject to the death penalty. So the rabbi said, yeah, that's fine, but you have to have 2 witnesses seeing the man and the woman go into the room alone. You have to have two men under the bed to actually witness the act. And then you have to have another 2 people watching them come outside and discussing what had just happened inside. Now, I don't know about you, but if ever I commit adultery, it won't be with 6 witnesses. So in other words, they effectively abolished it. Right. Similarly, that line in Leviticus where it says an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, which for us sounds really sort of mean. I mean, you poke my eye, I poke out your eye, doesn't really make sense at all. Well, the rabbis, again, first century, realized that, and so they read it as an eye's worth for an eye, a tooth's worth for a tooth. So I poke your eye out, and you then sue me for damages for the physical pain, for the embarrassment, for the medical fees, for the time off work. It sounds like really 21st century stuff, Bupa or PPP, but no, it's actually first century, and in what's called the Talmud, which is the rabbinic compendium of interpretations of the Bible, and which is why we're rabbinic Jews rather than the biblical Jews, because an enormous amount has changed since biblical times.
That's an interesting distinction, actually. That you make there, and also what you said before about Judaism having utility. I think that's definitely an interesting concept, because then I guess the follow-up question is something true from its utility? Is that kind of an angle that you're coming from, in a sense? Like the more utility an idea has, the more true it might be? Or are you kind of just saying, hey, look, regardless of actually whether we can demonstrate this, like you kind of alluded to, actually, look, this is a very useful ethos to live by. Is that your attitude?
Yes, it is partly. I mean, it's a bit like a painting. If you see a painting, you shouldn't judge it by the signature at the bottom right hand. Picasso, wonderful. You should judge it, do I like that painting or not? Does it inspire me? Does it calm me? Does it make me think? Or whoever's signature's at the bottom of the page. So we've got the supposed signature of God, if you like, or the inspiration of God, which is why we bother looking at it in the first place. So number 1 is, shall I bother looking at it? Yep. Tradition says it comes from an important source, so okay, at least I'll open it. But then question number 2 is, does it make sense to me? Do I want to, having opened it, carry on with it? There's a rather nice prayer just to illustrate this point, which starts off, our God, my God and God of my ancestors. And some rabbis have said, hang on, that's tautology, because that's the same God, so why you bother repeating it? And the answer is no, because God yes, it's God of the ancestors, the God we've inherited, the God we've been taught about, but that's not good enough. It has to become your God as well, the God that you've come to terms with. And by the way, what I just said is also an illustration of reform, because in the Orthodox prayer book, it would say, our God and God of our fathers. Whereas Reform has sort of got inclusive language, recognizing that 50% of the congregation is female, and therefore it's just elegantly changed it, our God and God of our ancestors, to be much more inclusive.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's definitely varied interpretations of Judaism, because it's the oldest, the oldest monotheism, of course. So how do you describe it being distinct from Christianity and Islam? I know that you've touched on a couple things, Jesus, but how, in a nutshell, how would you kind of explain the differences?
Well, Jesus actually is one of the differences, in that for Christians, of course, Jesus is the Son of God, the object of worship. We would regard Jesus as a historical person, a great teacher, obviously, a great, powerful preacher, full stop. In other words, acknowledging those gifts of teaching and preaching, but then stopping there and not going on to say he was God or Son of God or the Messiah. And for us, the reason for that is a very simple litmus test, again, practicalities. The Jewish concept of the Messiah was someone who brings peace or ushers in an era of peace. And we look at television, or we look at the papers, and just, still rapes and murders and wars and civil wars and strife and corruption. So clearly, for us, the Messiah isn't yet here. I suppose we would say that Christianity, or Christians would say, well, yes, it will come in the second coming. But we'd say, well, hang on, that's not part of the original job spec. It was supposed to be the first time round, mate. And therefore, for us, the Messiah hasn't come. And that's not just my view. I mean, actually, it's funny enough, it's even within the Gospels, because there's this bit in the New Testament, rather, in the Acts of the Apostles, when some people rush into the Sanhedrin, which is a Jewish parliament at the time in the first century, and say, look, there's this Jesus preaching and claiming to be all sorts of things. And there's a particular rabbi, and again, it's in the Acts of the Apostles, in the chapter itself. And he says, well, let's wait and see. If he's the Messiah, great, wonderful. And if he's not, okay, well, never mind, carry on waiting.
Yeah, it is. So on the, I guess, to be a bit of a devil's advocate, for viewers who might be Christian and who might be, roaring in their chair or something like that. So what would you say to the kind of maybe response that, there might be evil in this world, but perhaps evil still exists, or immorality, let's say, because of free will, because we, just because Jesus came, that doesn't mean we don't have free will still. What would you say back to that?
Sorry, I don't really understand the question. I mean,
no, don't worry. I can re-elaborate. So your point on, well, correct me if I'm wrong. Perhaps I misunderstood. So said about Jesus, and if he did come as the Messiah, for real, there wouldn't be any acts of immorality. There wouldn't be these rapes and pillaging and so on, or violence, let's say. And so your point was basically, well, why is this still happening if he came? And I guess the response would be,
well, okay, but the whole point for us of the Messiah, or as actually we tend to put more emphasis on the era, the Messianic era, because what's important is not so much the Messiah, but the era of peace is ushers in, it's an era of peace, and that's the whole point. So there wouldn't be to do all the rapes and the murder and the pillaging. Now, you could say, well, that's a very unlikely scenario. The whole thing about the Messianic era is really to offer a better vision of this world and say that what we've got is not the final version. And everyone will know that there have been moments when things really go right and people really pull together and root together. It could be in the family, everyone sort of being nice to each other, or in a sort of street or village, or when there's a sort of, I don't know, a jubilee coronation, and people are just pleasant and friendly and helpful and cheerful. And it may only last 20 minutes or even a day. Well, we know it can exist. So let's make that a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks or forever. So that possibility is still there. And also, the Jewish view is you don't just sit back and wait for the Messiah to appear and twiddle our thumbs, but we actually hasten the Messiah by trying to make this world a better place. And there's a good Jewish tradition that the Messiah will only come when we're almost there because of what our efforts have done to make this world a better place. And then his arrival is the final seal. By the way, just to pick you up, you said you're going to play devil's advocate. Well, I don't know if you were going to come onto this, but actually we don't believe in the devil. In other words, in Judaism, there's no concept of an outside evil force, a Satan or whatever. Certainly people can do rotten things, horrible things, but that's because they choose to, not because they're being seduced by an outside force. So we would believe that everyone is born completely free will, and as a blank slate, we've got no evil, we've got no original sin, and it's up to us. And we all have both good instincts and bad instincts. You know, it can be very selfish or very altruistic, and it's up to us to choose which way we follow.
It seems that Judaism, out of the Islam and Christianity, it seems like it's a far more actionable religion, as in the sense that Judaism, especially from what you described, is about your behavior, how you doing good, how you act. From the outside looking in, it seems that Judaism is far more to itself. It's less proselytizing than the other monotheisms. What
well, you've covered a lot of ground. Let's deal with the practical. I mean, the answer is, I think it is. That's not to diminish any of the other faiths or their attributes, but it's very noticeable that whereas, like in Christianity, you have the 39 Articles of Faith, which are the foundation of the Church of England. For us, we don't have Articles of Faith. We have the 10 Commandments. Thou shalt do this and do that. It's not about believing so much, but doing and getting on with it. And in Judaism, the heretic is not so much the person who believes the wrong thing, but who does the wrong thing. So we're very relaxed about concepts of God, and whereas sort of the Christians have had all sorts of wars, over heresies, and the Catholics and the Protestants and the Anabaptists and the Calvinists and the Zwinglians and all the rest of it, and quite a lot of persecution as to the wrong belief. We've been much more laid back and said, well, we can't necessarily define God, because if God's immortal and we're temporal, if God's incorporeal and we're not, how can we sort of define God? Once you define God, you limit them and put him in your pocket, so to speak. So we just say God is somehow responsible for the world and leave it at that. And therefore, actually, what we believe doesn't really matter, because God's not like one of the fairies in Peter Pan, where every time you say, I don't believe in fairies or God, one of them falls away. So what really counts is what we do. It doesn't matter what you believe. It's, do you help a little old lady across the road? Do you give to charity when you see it? Do you smile at someone or scowl at them? So it's actually getting on with people and how you behave that determines whether you're a good Jew. Which is why, by the way, although this may sound strange to some people, you can have atheist Jews. And you can't really be an atheist Christian. You really do have to believe in the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. But a lot of Jews are really a bit unsure about God, but they're still Jewish because they believe in Jewish roots and Jewish values, and Jewish traditions, and getting on with it. I'm generalizing quite a bit, because there's a lot of Jews who do believe very faithfully in God. But what I'm saying is that if you wanted to make a contrast, you could say that Christianity is much more about belief and faith, whereas Judaism is much more about action. It's not to say that Christians aren't active and good and helpful and charitable, but in terms of some of the contrasts, and which is why, going on to your other point, Judaism isn't interested in proselytizing or converting other people. Most synagogues have a conversion class, as I do at Maidenhead, but it's only for people who want to convert. I'm genuinely not, and I always tell them right at the beginning, look, you're welcome to come on the course, because it's a course about Jewish knowledge, but I don't actually care whether you do or not, and I don't care whether you drop out. If you want to stay, great, I'm there to help, but we're not into a numbers game, we're not into converting people. We believe that there are many paths to God, And it actually doesn't matter whether you call God or Adonai or Christ or Allah or Buddha. It's getting there as being a good person. So we're not into a numbers game.
Yeah, and I must say that, the fact in Judaism that it is far more varied in how it conceptualizes God. For example, I guess Judaism follows I think it was Augustine who said it. Even though he was Christian, but he said something along the lines of, "If it is God you are thinking of, it is not God," and that kind of was supposed to mean that, like, to conceptualize God is to negate what God is, and it is to even perhaps go further away from what it means. And I must admit, I'm fully behind that kind of idea, because as you kind of imply, a divine entity, deity, to me at least, Judaism actually has the most logical perspective on it, because by definition, God is transcendent, beyond the mortality that we have, and the mere words that we have. And so, yeah, honestly speaking, I do think Judaism holds the strongest conceptualization of God, because, as you say, otherwise it's quite literally in Christianity, it's more of a bodily interpretation. Jesus, for example. Yeah.
I mean, I suppose, to be fair, every religion has its weaknesses, but also its strengths. Judaism is very good on action and deeds and community and camaraderie. Christianity is probably much better on spirituality. Islam is probably better on discipline. Buddhism is better on self-knowledge. So, if you like, it depends what you're looking for in the religious supermarket.
Religious supermarket. I like that. So could you go more into Islam and how that's distinct from Judaism? Because we've covered Christianity a decent amount.
Yeah, I mean, well, often people think that Christians and Jews are more like each other than Jews and Muslims, but in many ways it's Jews and Muslims who are more similar, because the values are more or less the same, and a lot of the rituals are the same. Whether it's and Islam is much more into rituals than Christianity. I mean, by which I mean, of course, there are, because most of the doing stuff for a Christian is a church. The Eucharist and the communion, and whereas for Jews and also for Muslim, a lot of the rituals are home-based. I mean, at least 50% of Jewish rituals or festivals all take place in the home, and you can, don't tell my congregants this, you can almost be a good Jew and never go to synagogue in your life, because so much takes place at home, and which, by the way, is one of the reasons why it survived despite the odds and the persecutions, because children grow up with it and see it in the home and take it as natural. So going back to Islam, two obvious examples is one is both go in for circumcision of male babies. Both have food laws, such as the banning of pork and bacon and ham. So there's a lot of commonality. And I suppose people thought of the two as being very loggerheads, really because of the problems between Israel and some of the Arab neighbors. But that's very modern, and it's only been the last 70 years or so. Islam and Judaism, in many ways, got on better than Jews and Christians. I mean, we're in an interfaith era, so that's all changed now. But the problem with Jews and Christians was that Jews were always the villains in the Christian story. I mean, according to the Gospels, the Jews were responsible for the death of Jesus. And actually, if you think of all the sins in the world, I mean, murder, killing is pretty bad, but killing the Son of God has to be top of the list. You can't really get much worse than that. So it means that, unfortunately, Jews always have this negative perception within the Christian story, whereas, no other faith has that negative role within the Christian story, and Jews don't have that negative role in any other faith. They don't feature badly in Sikhism or Confucianism or Buddhism or Islam or Jainism or any of them. So there's been this unique, almost poison in the relationship between Jews and Christianity, because even though Jesus and the disciples all were Jewish and stemmed from Judaism, this poison in later teachings has really affected subsequent centuries. Conversely, Jews and Muslims just don't have that negative backstory.
Yeah, I must say that it definitely seems that, and it's been written in literature and quite famously actually, that the Jews have been the victims, as well as in many cases, and it comes back to this question as well of the political, and I feel it seems more like a political challenge, I guess, the Palestine and Israel sort of conflict. Would you say that that's? I mean, I know it's perhaps more politics, but would you say it is more religious than political, or would you say it is actually a political thing?
No, it's entirely political.
Right.
I mean, 100% political. I mean, there is no intrinsic enmity. I mean, I don't even want to use the word enmity because antagonism even between Jews and Muslims for religious reasons. None at all. And it's very noticeable that, for instance, I get on extraordinarily well with the local imam and his predecessors here in Maidenhead. Because we're away from the Middle East and away from the political context, and that divorced from that, there's no reason. So, for instance, to give you a couple of examples, on the first anniversary, so I'm just picking up a dog here.
No worries.
On the first anniversary of 9/11, I went to the mosque and said a prayer for peace in Hebrew. And the imam came to the synagogue and said a prayer for peace in Arabic. Now, there's some countries where saying a prayer in Hebrew in a mosque, you get shot for that, or if not shot, then lynched. But we could do that, and it didn't change the world. But it was a message to members of both congregations that we were on the same side. And a few years later, when the mosque was undergoing repairs and building works, and believe it or not, the builders didn't complete on time. Would you believe that? And therefore, this big event they were going to be holding, a sort of big talk, their mosque wasn't ready. So the imam rang me up and said, look, could we hold their meeting at the synagogue? So number one, he had my phone number. Number two, he had no problem shifting his religious meeting to the synagogue. So that says it all.
Yeah, for sure. I certainly agree with that. Could you go more into detail about why exactly and what kind of evidence Judaism kind of posits against Christianity in terms of Christ's divinity? Like, what are the central arguments against it? Because I know, of course, one of them is historicity, like it's a historical argument. Like, could you go a bit deeper into that?
Well, there are no problems with with Jesus' teaching.
Yeah.
And the Sermon on the Mount, any rabbi could have said both in Jesus' time or today. And many of the things that Jesus said, I mean, his most famous for is love your neighbor as yourself, which, of course, is already in the Hebrew Bible. Ve'ahavta et re'echa kamocha. There's some Hebrew on your show. And it's in the book of Leviticus. So he was just quoting Jewish teaching. And I often have to remind people, yes, Jesus said it, but actually he was quoting the Hebrew Bible. So there's no problem with any of the ethics and the values. And the problem, if you like, only started after the death of Jesus and with Paul, who started preaching a very different type of faith. And then there's this battle, which again we see played out within the New Testament in the Acts of the Apostles, between the followers of Jesus, who were known as the Nazarenes, who saw him as a sort of super prophet, really, an Elijah figure, perfectly respectable within Jewish tradition, and those who belonged to the Pauline Church, who saw him as something different and introduced these what you might call Greek concepts of the Son of God and the Messiah, and not entirely human. And that's when there was called the Great Divide. So it's really a matter of theology. And was Jesus the Messiah or not? And we say no. Not that there's anything wrong, by the way, to claim to be the Messiah. And there have been dozens and dozens and dozens, I mean, hundreds perhaps, of Jews who have claimed to be the Messiah. And the Jewish attitude has always been, well, great, this is what we've been waiting for. And then after a day or two, it's quite obvious. And in one famous case, it took a year before it was quite obvious that peace wasn't there and didn't reign supreme. And therefore, this person was not necessarily the imposter, was maybe someone who's either Well, it could have been a charlatan, it could have been deluded, or could have just been hopeful or over enthusiastic or preempting the messianic age. Nothing wrong to be claimed to be the Messiah, and we're still waiting. But as I said, not just sitting back, but trying to help our age come closer ourselves.
Almost setting the messianic example in some sense.
And again, I emphasize that for us, it's not the person that's important, like a Jesus, because in the Jewish concept, the Messiah will come and then probably die, but it's the era of peace, which is why we prefer to talk about the messianic era or messianic age.
Right. The points you made about the theology and the kind of, I guess, the differences between what Jesus actually said and then what Paul tried to promote it as. I'd be interested for you to expand on that, because that sounded like a really interesting avenue. I know it's perhaps quite a niche aspect of it all, and I'm not sure if that's something that you've thought about quite a lot in particular. But I'd be interested in hearing what Paul actually did and how and why you think it was so different from what Jesus genuinely actually meant when he was.
Well, one of the problems is we're not entirely sure what Jesus did mean, because a lot of the things he batted away. And when somebody, I think Pilate says, are you the Son of God or the King of the Jews? He says, that's what you say, or that's what people say. And it's very rare that Jesus actually makes an outright claim for himself. But it is Paul who sort of develops the picture and develops the theology, and really takes Jesus, from our point of view, away from the Jewish tradition in which he came. And again, just because it is not always obvious, but well, it will be to some people, Jesus was Jewish. And perhaps one of the most shocking things for some people is when I ask them, when you go into church, there's always like a calendar board where they've got the hymns, and it also tells the date and what festival or feast it is, because every day is virtually a feast day of this or that saint. Now, most people don't go into church on January the 1st. They've got a hangover from the night before. But if they do, they will see the date as the feast of the circumcision, because January the 1st is 8 days after December the 25th. December the 25th, Jesus is born. Jesus, being Jewish, is therefore circumcised, as laid out in the book of Genesis, on the 8th day. And people think, what? Jesus circumcised? And the idea of God being circumcised or that happening to the Son of God just doesn't ring true for a lot of people. But actually, it's all there within Christianity. So the Jewish roots of Jesus are really not under dispute by anybody. But once you get into the later books of the Bible, the letters to the Corinthians and Philippians and Thessalonians and so forth, then you get this sort of development, which then goes much further in the Church Fathers, of Jesus as somebody who gets sort of almost divorced or taken away from his Jewish context and becomes something totally different and an object of worship in himself, as opposed to what I think is more likely in the gospel, where he is a teacher and preacher, but he's not an object of worship.
Right. Yeah. That was really, really interesting. I'm particularly interested in the history and the conflict of ideas. And would you say, in that sense, that you could say Paul is actually the issue, not really Jesus? It's actually Paul who the Jewish kind of religion has this disagreement with fundamentally.
Yeah, and which is why, in scholarly books or academic books, you talk about Pauline Christianity. So the Christianity as developed by Paul. Now, that's fair enough, because I said earlier that Jews have changed and that we're no longer biblical Jews, we're rabbinic Jews. So Christians are probably Christians, not so much of the Gospels, but of the later books or the Pauline Christianity. But, that's fair enough. Islam has changed enormously as well. And to be fair, if Jesus came back, he'd probably have a fit. And if he walked into church, wouldn't recognize it at all, or the bishops or the popes. But the same would apply to Moses. Wouldn't know where he was in a synagogue, because all faiths have developed and changed over the centuries. They often claim to be the voice of tradition, but there's no doubt that tradition has changed enormously.
Yeah, because I often have this thought, and it came to me from reading Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov, and it was the idea that, let's say a kind of Messiah did come. Who's to say that the modern world did even embrace him and even to demonstrate that he is the Messiah? I feel like, because initially it feels like, yeah, it would be easy. You would just study, I don't know, walking on water, let's say, and you could study whether that was genuine or not. But then people would say, oh, well, maybe it's a trick, it's a mass hallucination by aliens. And so it's really interesting, because you talked about how these things are so difficult to prove, from a historical perspective, specifically. And I do think, would people even believe in a Messiah? Like, how would we even come to demonstrate that he would be? Have you thought about that issue? Because of course you're skeptical of the claim of Jesus being one, and of course that 2,000 years ago. But do you think that would be a difficult process?
Well, the walking on water bit is a good example, because yes, people would say, how did he do it? And actually, to me, that would be a good example of, this is irrelevant. I mean, what's the big deal? I mean, okay, so he walks on water, but so what? That doesn't change anything.
Yeah.
So what would count, and I think what would people pay to, is, that people changed, and people were pleasant, and people were nice, and the criminals stopped being criminals, and dictators stopped invading other countries, and so that's always been the Jewish litmus test, not magic tricks like feeding the 5,000 or walking on water, or some other miracle, by anybody else, because big deal. It's actually being, and this is really the ultimate Jewish criteria. Does someone, Jesus or anyone, bring real lasting peace? If he's yes, Messiah. If not, well, let's keep waiting.
Is that's an interesting perspective, because I feel like even then, I mean, maybe from the Jewish perspective it would be legitimate, but to people outside of that, they would say, well, just because people are acting morally because a guy came and everybody listened to him, they'd be like, well, okay, but why does it make him the Messiah? And what would you say to that?
I wouldn't care. I mean, it doesn't matter whether they believe in the Messiah or not. The point is that Messianic age has come. Because again, we wouldn't get hung up whether you believe in him or don't believe in him, or pray to him or don't pray to him. The point is the era, the peace. And that would be just such a wonderful, almost unbelievable state to arrive at, given the world as it is. But, I mean, what does every politician say? I'm in politics to make things better. I mean, I suppose the same would apply to anybody who goes to church, mosque, synagogue, gurdwara. We're praying not just for ourselves, but also for society as a whole. And we pray that wars will be ended and famines will come to an end, etc., etc. So we all have this basic motive of trying to not only look out for ourselves, but look out for the wider world that we're part of. And if that comes, that will be sufficient in itself.
Yeah, the Messiah.
Which is why, again, Judaism doesn't really put so much emphasis on the Messiah, whether it's going to be a he or a she, or tall or ugly, or die the next day. It's the era, it's the time of peace, and people getting on with each other. It comes back to that simple love your neighbor as yourself, which is, probably the best political slogan you'll ever come across.
Yeah, it is intriguing how a Christian would kind of respond to that, like, the Messiah coming again, and they would probably say, yeah, miracles and water, performing exorcisms. But then actually you would turn around and say, under Judaism, actually, no, it's about how moral and how the positive influence moves civilization forward. I find that distinction really interesting, that it is in that sense. I guess from a personal perspective, I'm still stuck on that thing of how would we genuinely demonstrate that? I mean, in a loose sense, we could say, somebody, I don't know, I mean, because you could say about a politician, for example, you could say, look, this guy is great, his rallies are great, and people are following him. Does that make him the Messiah? I guess I'm still stuck on how to, how would you?
Yeah, you're stuck on that, because again, get away from rituals, get away from belief. It doesn't matter whether you worship the Messiah. or not.
Yeah.
The point is, it's what's happening outside your window when you look outside. Is the street safe or not? Are people cheerful or unhappy? So, if people acknowledge the Messiah as the Messiah, great. And if they don't, well, he's still the Messiah, or rather, the Messianic era is still there. So, if you don't mind me saying so, you seem to be very locked into a sort of Christian concept of worship or obedience or faith. It doesn't really matter.
Right.
It's here.
Well, I suppose it's tempting to be locked in a Christian mentality, and I guess, from a dispositional perspective, like Judeo-Christian, the ethos is heavily in Western civilization for sure. So thanks for that response. It was really interesting. And I have one final question. So considering the modern age and considering how there's kind of militant atheists, new atheism, people often say, why don't we just throw religion out, regardless of whether it's, I don't know, they would say sometimes useful, or even be so bold as to say never useful, like Christopher Hitchens, religion poisons everything. I personally find that abhorrent as a slogan. I just don't think that's a rational claim, subtitle, whatever you want to call it. Why do you think we should not abandon religion? Maybe despite being useful by your standard, but are there other reasons, or is it just utility?
There's 2 reasons. The 2 reasons. Firstly, because it helps individuals, and secondly, because it helps society. Just to go back on those, helps individuals. A lot of people find comfort in religion. Whether it gives them a sense of identity or a sense of purpose or a sense of not being alone. I mean, it's a big universe out there. And, you often ask yourself, who am I and what am I doing and what's the point of it all and where am I going? And people can easily feel very lost. And religion provides answers. Now, some people will not everybody will like those answers, or not one particular religion's answers, but for some people, it gives them a sense of who they are and where they're going. And it grounds them in a certain rootedness. And secondly, it's not just about the individual, it's about society. Now, it's certainly true that in the past, religion has, been responsible for some awful things. But no more than secular society has been responsible, because you could say that that the greatest villains of all were all the atheists, your Hitler and your Mao Zedong and your Stalin and your Pol Pot. But religion can do good, whether it's sort of hospices or places for lepers in Africa, or drug rehabilitation centres in London, or food banks. Not that other people don't do those as well, but religion has actually often been in the forefront of a lot of charity work. And much more today, I think, when we've got a much more, I suppose, kinder and maturer type of religion, we have to admit, than in the past, then the religion is a force for good. Not the only one, but it's certainly an important one.
Yeah, the atheist point, and how throughout history there's been atheists who have kind of used it apparently and things like that. I've always found that kind of a mixed bag, because when I've tackled that question initially, I was like, that seems fair, and then I was thinking, well, actually, atheism, maybe this is disputed, and I can get your thoughts on this. Like, atheism is simply a lack of belief in an active disbelief or a lack of belief in God or gods, and that's all it is. Whereas theism is a whole worldview, whereas atheism is quite literally not. So I guess the conclusion I've come to at present is it wasn't necessarily atheism as such. It was perhaps that they felt like they had no moral responsibility. Would you personally make that distinction, or do you actually think atheism itself, the title, is appropriate to use as a consequence of such things, or do you think it is because they were aware that there's no higher consequence for their actions?
No, I wouldn't say that they were ghastly people because they were atheists, because there's many very saintly atheists.
Yeah.
But what I'm saying is that in a non-religious society, people can be just as brutal as, unfortunately, people were in previous religious societies. And, you know, it just behoves all of us, when we look at history, whether we're religious or not, to sort of look in the mirror and say, what's our object? What are we doing? Are we helping? Are we harming? And some people will find religion as a very good tool, if you like, for personal direction, family unity, and social cohesion.
Yeah, so I certainly agree that religion offers that kind of, you know, not only, I guess, existential consolation, but practical guidance and how to live. You know, I'm agnostic atheist, but I still genuinely believe that the implications of atheism aren't good at all. They aren't something that we should cheer about. I mean, Nietzsche understood this with his God is dead. Atheism isn't something to write home about. It's quite a horrific implication, existential implication. But of course, because I'm not personally convinced, I can't kind of escape. I can't, as much as I don't want that to be true, I can't escape, you know, being a disbeliever. If Judaism were not true, would you practice the values and the behaviors and, you know, the routines of Judaism, because, as you say, they are useful? Do you think you would actually do that? You would kind of continue to act as if you are Jewish, even though hypothetically, let's say, for some reason it wasn't true?
Well, I mean, Judaism is literally a faith, by which I don't mean like that's the noun. I mean, it's an act of faith. I mean, you know, we don't really know whether an Abraham or Moses actually existed. We just got a book that tells us he did. Until we find a grave saying, "Here lies Abraham, much missed by his loving wife Sarah," we'll never know for sure. But it comes back to a point that we discussed earlier, that it's what's been handed down. Does that make sense? Is it helpful? Is it useful? And for me, the answer is yes. So for me, and I suspect for most Jews, yes, there's a lot of rituals. Yes, there's a lot of tradition. But what's core, of course, is the values. And that's what guides us every day. And that's what's the 24/7 justification for it.
It was a really interesting conversation, Jonathan. I really appreciate you coming on the channel and sharing your thoughts, and of course, you know, the Reform perspective of Judaism and the history of Judaism. It's a really interesting conversation.
Good. Yeah. I've enjoyed it.
Yeah.
All the best.
So thank you.
May I say God bless.
All right, Jonathan, thank you.